Hinterkaifeck was a small, lonely farmstead located in Bavaria, Germany, about 70 kilometers north of Munich. The farm sat in isolation, nestled between the towns of Grobern and Beethoven. The nearest neighbors were more than half a kilometer away, making the property feel cut off from the rest of the world. The Gruber family, who owned and worked the farm, were known to keep to themselves, reinforcing the eerie solitude of the place. The farm was home to Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, and Victoria's two children, Cecilia and Joseph. Victoria's husband had died in World War I, leaving her a single mother. Adding to the household was Maria Baumgartner, a maid who had just arrived on the farm the day before the murders. Despite their relative prosperity, the Grubers were not well liked in the community. Andreas, the patriarch, was known for being a harsh and sometimes cruel man. He had a reputation for mistreating farmhands and was rumored to have an incestuous relationship with his daughter Victoria. She had tried to escape the farm once by joining a church choir in a neighboring town, but she had eventually returned, possibly under pressure from her father. In the months leading up to the tragedy, several strange and unsettling events occurred at Hinterkaifeck. 6 months before the murders, the family's previous maid had abruptly quit, claiming the house was haunted. She reported hearing strange sounds at night, like footsteps in the attic, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The Grubers dismissed her fears, but in the weeks before the crime, Andreas himself began noticing odd occurrences. One evening, he discovered footprints in the snow leading from the nearby woods to the farm, but none leading back. He also found a newspaper in the house that no one in the family recognized. Days before the murders, he told neighbors that his house keys had gone missing. At night, the family heard unusual sounds in the attic again, but when Andreas searched, he found nothing. On the morning of April 4th, 1922, life in the quiet Bavarian countryside carried on as usual, except at Hinterkaifeck. The Gruber family had not been seen in days. Victoria and her daughter Cecilia had missed school and church services, which was highly unusual. The postman also noticed that their mail had not been collected, but it was the farm's absence from daily village life that truly raised concern. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor and former suitor of Victoria, was among the first to suspect something was wrong. By that afternoon, he gathered two other local men, Johann Siegel and Michael Pell, and together they made their way to the Gruber farm. As they approached, they noted the eerie silence. The livestock, still alive, were restless and hungry, suggesting that no one had tended to them in days. They entered the barn first, where they made a horrific discovery. Beneath a layer of hay lay 4 bodies: Andreas, Cecilia, elder, Victoria, and young Cecilia. All had been brutally killed. Shaken, the men moved into the house. Inside the main living quarters, they found 2 more victims. Joseph lay dead in his crib, his skull smashed in, and Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, was found lifeless in her room, still in the same clothes she had worn when she arrived just the day before. She had barely been in the house 24 hours before meeting her gruesome fate. Despite the carnage, an unsettling detail stood out. The house had not been abandoned. The animals had been fed, food had been eaten from the kitchen, and the fireplace had recently been used. Someone had been living in the house after the murders, going about daily tasks as if nothing had happened. The 3 men rushed back to the village to alert the authorities. When the police arrived later that evening, They were met with one of the most perplexing crime scenes in German history. The crime scene at Hinterkaifeck was unlike anything the authorities had encountered before. Investigators from the Munich police, led by Inspector Georg Reingruber, arrived at the farm later on April 4, 1922. As they surveyed the gruesome scene, they were struck by several disturbing details that made the case both horrifying and deeply perplexing. The autopsies, conducted on site by Dr. Johann Baptist Aumüller, revealed that all 6 victims had died from massive head trauma inflicted by a blunt, sharp-edged object. Later believed to be a mattock, a type of pickaxe used for farming. Andreas Gruber, his skull was smashed in, with deep wounds exposing his brain. His face was nearly unrecognizable. Cecilia Gruber, similar injuries with the back of her head destroyed. Victoria Gabriel, her skull had been struck multiple times and strangulation marks were found on her neck, suggesting she may have been choked before her death. Cecilia Gabriel, the most unsettling case. Her injuries indicated she had survived for several hours after the attack, tearing out tufts of her own hair in agony before finally dying. Josef Gabriel, killed in his crib, his head smashed with a single blow. Maria Baumgartner, killed in her bed with wounds similar to the others. Bloodstains were everywhere, but what disturbed investigators most was the time that had passed between the murders and the discovery. Despite the violent nature of the crime, there were no signs of immediate robbery or forced entry. Instead, the evidence suggested that the murderer had stayed on the farm for several days after the killings. The cows had been milked. The chimney showed signs of recent use, meaning the killer had warmed themselves by the fire. Food had been prepared and eaten. Neighbors had even reported smoke rising from the chimney after the Grubers had already been dead. Whoever committed the crime had not only killed the family, but had taken up residence in the very home they had turned into a slaughterhouse. One of the biggest challenges in the investigation was that the murder weapon was nowhere to be found. Investigators suspected a mattock or a pickaxe, commonly used in farming, but none were located at the scene. Additionally, a few small but notable items were missing. Andreas's house keys, which he had reported missing days before the crime. Victoria's savings book, hinting at a possible financial motive. Some food and personal items, which may have been taken by the murderer while living in the house. However, large amounts of cash were left behind, suggesting that robbery was not the primary motive. The case was baffling. There were no clear suspects, and the isolated nature of the farm meant that there were no witnesses. Investigators were left with more questions than answers. With no immediate arrests and no clear motive, investigators turned their attention to potential suspects. The brutality of the murders, combined with the eerie post-crime behavior of the killer, led to several theories, each more unsettling than the last. One of the first people under suspicion was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the very man who had helped discover the bodies. Schlittenbauer had been romantically involved with Victoria Gabriel, and many believed that he was the father of her 2-year-old son, Josef. However, the situation was complicated. Officially, Josef's birth certificate listed Victoria's father, Andreas Gruber, as the father, fueling rumors of incest within the Gruber family. Schlittenbauer had wanted to marry Victoria, but Andreas forbade the union. After Victoria's husband died in World War I, Schlittenbauer rekindled his interest, but a dispute over Josef's true paternity created tension. Witnesses reported that Schlittenbauer had paid Victoria child support, but he later tried to retract the payments, possibly out of anger. When Schlittenbauer arrived at the farm with the search party, his behavior was suspicious. Upon seeing the bodies, he was oddly calm and even handled the corpses with his bare hands, which was unusual for the time. He opened doors without hesitation, as if he knew the layout of the home better than expected. Some claimed he had made cryptic remarks, such as suggesting where the missing keys might be. Despite these suspicions, there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. He was questioned multiple times but was never formally charged. Another theory pointed to disgruntled former workers at Hinterkaifeck. Andreas Gruber was known for being a cruel and abusive employer. Several farmhands had quit under mysterious or hostile circumstances. One former worker, Carl Gabriel, Victoria's supposedly dead husband, was rumored to be alive and seeking revenge, though this was later debunked. Investigators looked into multiple ex-workers, but they found no concrete connections between any of them and the murders. Given the isolated nature of the farm, another possibility was that the killer was a wandering vagrant or a robber. However, this theory had significant flaws. If the motive was robbery, why was money left behind? If the killer was a random vagrant, why stay in the house for days after committing the crime? The killer seemed familiar with the property, suggesting they had been there before. There were occasional reports of strange men seen in the area before the murders, but nothing conclusive ever came from these leads. One of the most disturbing theories revolved around Josef's true father. If Josef was, in fact, Andreas Gruber's child, the murder could have been a crime of rage and shame. Some suspected that Victoria wanted to leave, and that a family dispute escalated into murder. Could Andreas himself have killed everyone before taking his own life? Unlikely, as his injuries suggested an attack from someone else. Did someone from the village kill out of disgust for the incest rumors? No direct evidence supported this, but the scandal was widely whispered about. Ultimately, the lack of forensic advancements in 1922 meant that police could never confirm or disprove these theories. A crime that would never be solved. Despite extensive investigations and even modern forensic attempts, no arrests were ever made. Over the decades, new theories emerged, but the true identity of the killer remains unknown. The Hinterkaifeck murders became one of the most haunting cold cases in German history, with the mystery still unsolved over a century later. Despite the gruesome nature of the crime, investigators faced enormous challenges in solving the Hinterkaifeck murders. The rural setting, the lack of forensic technology, and the delayed discovery of the bodies all contributed to a case that would ultimately remain unsolved. When Inspector Georg Reingruber and his team arrived at Hinterkaifeck on April 4, 1922, they quickly realized they were dealing with a complex and unusual crime scene. However, the investigation was plagued by mistakes from the start. Before police even arrived, curious villagers had already walked through the house and barn, disturbing crucial evidence. Some had moved the bodies and fed the animals, making it difficult to establish the exact timeline. In 1922, fingerprinting was still a developing science in Germany and was not widely used in rural police work. DNA analysis would not exist for decades, meaning any hair, skin, or blood evidence was useless to investigators. In 1923, just a year after the murders, authorities decided to demolish Hinterkaifeck. During the demolition, workers found the murder weapon, a bloody mattock, hidden in the attic, meaning it had been overlooked during the initial investigation. These errors all but ensured that vital evidence was lost forever. Investigators questioned over 100 people, from locals to traveling tradesmen, but no strong suspects emerged. Lorenz Schlittenbauer remained the prime suspect for some time, but there was never enough evidence to charge him. The incest rumors surrounding Andreas and Victoria fueled speculation that a family dispute led to murder. But this could not be proven. Farmhands, ex-workers, and drifters were investigated, but none were connected to the crime. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was that no clear motive was ever established. Robbery? The killer left behind large amounts of money. Revenge? But against whom? And for what? A personal vendetta? If so, why kill the entire family, including the children? With no solid leads and no new evidence, the case quickly went cold. Several odd details still haunted the investigators. The missing keys and strange footsteps days. Before the murder, Andreas Gruber told neighbors that his house keys had vanished. Investigators never found the missing keys. Did the killer take them? The mysterious footsteps in the snow leading from the woods but not back suggested that someone had been stalking the family. The sounds in the attic. The previous maid had left because of unexplained noises, and even Andreas had begun hearing them. Was the murderer living in the attic before the attack? The killers stay in the house. The most chilling fact: the killer remained at Hinterkaifeck for days after the crime. Why? Was the murderer waiting for something? Hiding? Or was it part of their twisted plan? These questions remain unanswered, adding to the haunting nature of the case. By the late 1920s, the investigation slowed to a halt. Without new evidence, police had no choice but to close the case. Years passed, and while new theories emerged, no arrests were ever made. The murderer, whoever they were, had gotten away with one of the most gruesome mass murders in German history. The Hinterkaifeck murders became a chilling reminder of how some crimes remain forever unsolved.